Though the above-mentioned steps were taken in order to the rearing up of prelacy, and though, as Calderwood observes, quote, the chief opposites unto this course were either banished, warded, or confined, yet the court durst not venture upon a free election amongst the remnant of the ministry, unquote. Therefore, when a General Assembly is indicted at Glasgow in 1610, all the members are nominated by the king. At this pretended assembly, the bishops are appointed constant moderators of synods, and a negative was given them over synods and presbyteries. Calderwood makes the following observation concerning episcopacy, as it was introduced by the foresaid assembly. Quote, there was no mention made in the assembly of Glasgow of the consecration of bishops. For howbeit the unhappy pack were convened, tied presbyteries and synods unto them in the cases expressed, yet meant they not to determine that there was a distinct office in the word, differing from the office of a minister. For by the bishop of the diocese, in the Act of Glasgow, is not meant a bishop of office, but only a simple minister. So stilled is the preceding assembly, and that vulgarly in respect of its great benefice of bishopric. Unquote. As the members of the foresaid pretended assembly were all nominated by the king, so there were none of the honest party of the ministry present, and, as Calderwood reports, neither was it convenient that they should mix with them. In his history, page 623. Again, the 5 Articles of Perth, whereby some of the English ceremonies were brought into Scotland, were concluded by a meeting at Perth, usurping the name and authority of a General Assembly, but testified against by the bulk and body of ministers and professors through the land. From what is above observed, we may see a vast difference betwixt the conduct of judicatories during the period before 1638 and the practice of the present judicatories, as, for instance, the course of defection from the year 1596 and downward was carried on by threatenings and manifold acts of force and violence from the civil powers. But the course of defection is carried on at present by the judicatories themselves. Our ruin is from ourselves. There is no violence or force done the judicatories. They are not terrified with threatenings. They walk readily and willingly in their present backsliding course and way. Again, the above-mentioned course of defection was carried on by packed meetings of some corrupt ministers with noblemen and gentlemen who usurped the name and authority of a General Assembly, when, as Mr. Forster observes, the true representatives or lawful assemblies of the Church of Scotland never consented to the said course of defection. The cry of ministers and presbyteries during that period was for a free and lawful General Assembly, consisting of members chosen according to the form and order prescribed by the Church of Scotland. But this they could not obtain till the memorable 1638, when the Lord turned back the captivity of his people. But the present course of defection is carried on by General Assemblies, consisting of members chosen after that usual manner by presbyteries. From all which it is evident that the present course of defection is carried on by the present judicatories of this national church in their ecclesiastical or judicative capacity, and who in the same capacity are willingly walking after the commandments of men, whereas the course of defection from 1596 to 1638 was carried on by outward violence and force from the secular powers, and by pretended assemblies in opposition unto the contendings, not of ministers only, but also of the proper judicatories of the Church of Scotland. The next thing that I am to inquire into is, if such as faithfully witness against the course of defection during the above-mentioned period did contend in any way of church communion with the corrupt party, or if they contended in a way of secession from them. The author of the essay is very peremptory and positive, as we have heard, that they all contended in a way of church communion, but in this he misrepresents their conduct and procedure. And in several particular instances he asserts what is neither truth nor matter of fact. It is therefore needful that upon this head I give some particular instances of secession from the corrupt party that were carrying on at this time a course of defection, and from the practice and declared sentiments of some eminent ministers that I shall name. I hope to make it evident that their contending was not always in a way of church communion with the corrupt party, or with their corrupt judicatories, as the author of the essay positively determines. And for the clearing this head, I may observe in the first place that many presbyteries, as well as particular ministers, expressly disown the authority and constitution of the several pretended assemblies in that period, as also they refused obedience to their acts. Many presbyteries, as I have narrated above, never admitted to the constant moderators appointed by the pretended assembly at Linlithgow, 1606, and when the 5 Articles were passed by the pretended assembly at Perth, the most part of presbyteries, as well as particular ministers, refused to acknowledge the authority of that assembly. or to yield obedience to its acts and constitutions. Any that read Calderwood's history may see what numbers of ministers were suspended, deprived, and confined for refusing obedience to the said acts to the acts of the said assembly, and for their disowning it as a pretended and unlawful assembly. The prelatic party, who were going alongst with the court measures, durst not venture the cause of such ministers to be tried by their presbyteries, and therefore a court called the High Commission was erected by the king's sole authority, and by this court the above sentences were passed against them. And when the Parliament met anon 1621, where the Articles of Perth were ratified, a great body of the ministry convened at Edinburgh, and agreed upon a solemn protestation against the usurped government of the bishops and the Articles of Perth. But being charged by proclamation to depart out of the town, they leave an information and admonish behind them to be put into the hands of the members of Parliament, wherein they condemn the meeting at Perth as an unlawful assembly, and their proceedings as null and void. They likewise agreed upon a solemn protestation against the usurped government of the bishops and the ceremonies to be given in to the Parliament in case they should ratify the Perth Articles. This protestation was signed by one of their number in name of the rest, whom they empowered to give it unto the Parliament. But when he could not get access unto the Parliament House, he affixed a copy of the said protestation on the cross and other public places, taking instruments in the usual manner when the Act of Parliament ratifying Perth Articles was published. Calderwood likewise reports that the greatest part of the best qualified ministers through the land and of the most zealous professors refused the authority and constitution of Perth Assembly. Although a paper before me entitled A Short Relation of the State of the Kirk of Scotland since the Reformation of Religion unto the present time, for information and an advertisement to our brethren in the Kirk of England, etc., published anon 1638, bears, quote, that the most religious and judicious of the ministry did solemnly protest in name of the Reformed Kirk of Scotland against the ratification of the Articles of Perth in Parliament, whereunto the most part of the particular congregations have adhered and never practiced these articles, unquote. Upon what I have now observed, I may inquire at the author of the essay whether or not, if presbyteries, ministers, and professors should not only refuse to give obedience to the acts of the present national assemblies, but likewise disown their authority and constitution, would not such presbyteries be reckoned seceding presbyteries? And would not such ministers and professors in like manner be reckoned seceders? And, in this very period, the charge of schism and separation was laid against these faithful ministers, who disowned the authority of the present assembly, of the pretended assemblies, of the said period. When this charge was laid against that zealous minister, Mr. John Scrimger, minister at Kinghorn, before the High Commission Court, he replied, quote, as for my keeping a schism, ye do wrong to allege so. Ye shall not be able to quit yourselves of it. We walked all soundly in the truth. Ye have leaped from us. Ye have made schisms, unquote. Before I give instances of the sentiments and practice of some eminent ministers during this period, I must take notice of what is affirmed by our author, page 14, quote, yea, says he, in former times of great defections, worthy ministers were so far from thinking it duty to separate and erect themselves in separate judicatories, that when court and kirk would have them forsake these judicatories, they still attended and opposed sinful measures taken in them at the time, unquote. And he mentions two that were discharged by the court to go to the judicatories in the year 1607, that is, Mr. John Carmichael and Mr. Henry Livingston, who was confined to his own parish, upon account of the proceedings at Perth Synod above mentioned. But our author might have known that the proper judicatories of the Church of Scotland were then contending for their just rights and privileges, in opposition to oppression and violence from the court. It is true that at the time the court confined many worthy ministers and discharged them to attend upon presbyteries and synods, and a design to carry on the cause of episcopacy, and it was the duty of ministers to attend upon the proper judicatories in order to testify and witness against the encroachments that were made upon them, an instance of which I have given in the faithful behavior of the Synod of Perth and Stirling. And I must also here observe that our author is mistaken when he affirms that the Kirk at this time would have worthy ministers forsake these judicatories. He can give no instances of this from any ecclesiastical judicatory at that time in being. The two instances above mentioned do only prove that the court would have had them forsake their judicatories. But though ministers attended the judicatories before the pretended assembly at Glasgow 1610, yet the case altered very much, when the said assemblies appointed bishops to preside in synods and gave them a negative over them. Then many honest ministers refused to attend the said assemblies, the said synods, and said pretended assembly, judging it would be so, did enact, quote, that whatsoever minister, without just cause and lawful excuse made, shall absent himself from the visitation or the diocesan assembly, he shall be suspended from his office and benefice, and if he amend not, shall be deprived, unquote. And this made many ministers obnoxious to the High Commission Court, who, as Calderwood observes, put in execution the acts of assemblies, overruled by the bishops, in regard they knew very well that they would not get the concurrence of the ordinary judicatories of the Church. After the said pretended assembly, synods became very unfrequent. Many honest ministers had no freedom to be present at them. I shall not weary the reader with many particular instances, only he may take one amongst many, and that is of Mr. David Calderwood, who, according to our author, essay page 178, contended in a way of church communion betwixt 1610 and 1638. I find that this great man reports that at a conference he had with some of the bishops, he urged them to repair to the synods. And the bishop of Caithness said to him, quote, come and say, hic sum, that is, I am here, and then do as you please, unquote. To which Mr. Calderwood replied, quote, that hic sum, or I am here, is the question, unquote. And he gives some weighty reasons why he could not be present at synods. I hope that the reader will be satisfied that this is an instance of a considerable minister who declined to contend in a way of church communion with the backsliding party. I shall likewise give him the judgment upon this head of one who was reckoned amongst the most eminent ministers of the Church of Scotland, that is, Mr. John Welsh, who in a letter directed to Mr. Robert Bruce, after charging the bishops with perfidy and apostasy, etc., concludes, quote, therefore, they are not to be heard any more, either in public or in consistories, colleges, or synods, for what fellowship hath light with darkness, unquote. What can be more plain for secession from the corrupt party in that period? Yet our author has the assurance to say, in essay page 12, quote, that our worthy ancestors from the year 1596 continued in the Church without making secession or separation, though still they struggled against her defections, unquote. And amongst other worthy men he names Masters David Calderwood and John Welsh. Likewise, the same Mr. Welsh was imprisoned on account of his being at the assembly at Aberdeen, and also banished in the year 1606, and he has never returned again to Scotland. So he never joined in communion with any of the corrupt party, or with the corrupt judicatories. I shall here likewise subjoin the judgment of that great man, Mr. James Melville, concerning the manner after which he thought the Lord's witness in that period should have testified, as it lies in a letter he sends from England directed to one of his confined brethren in Scotland, where I find the following words, quote, alas, if that spirit of action, zeal, and courage, that sometimes did mightily reign in our kirk, were kindled up again, that might make a few from every presbytery and province to convene together in the name of Christ and censure these corruptions of the kirk to the utmost, unquote. In these words, this eminent minister gives his judgment in a very pathetic manner, not only for secession from the corrupt party at that time, but also for meeting together in a distinct judicative capacity from them in order to censure them on account of their corruptions. Yea, he declares it to be the duty even of a few to exercise the key of discipline in censuring the corrupt party.